Good evening, everybody, and I'm here to share with you how you can help train your brain or train the brains of your children at home while we're in COVID-19, and hopefully stem the tide of the brain drain that's happening with all our children spending only a few hours doing school-related academic content. Today we're going to cover a few topics. The first I will talk about is just a little bit about the research. A lot of people ask the question of, does this really work? Is it really effective? Can you really change your brain? All of those kinds of questions I get on a regular basis. So I'm going to go through at a very high level the research that is available to us, and I can direct you to more research if you're interested. Then I'll talk about what are cognitive skills and what is the profile that your child has or what you have. What is your relative strength and weaknesses? And I'll give you some tips on that. And then I'll jump into, for the bulk of the presentation tonight, are different things you can do at home with the stuff that you have in your house. This is not meant to be something you have to go out and spend a lot of money on, but just random objects in your house that you can use. And even if you don't have some of the items, there are a lot of things you can do to work around what maybe you don't have at your home. So this is meant to be something where you can really take what you have and benefit your children quite a bit. So the first point I want to make on this is that the big lie we've all were told is that our mental skills and our IQ are fixed at birth. Nothing we can do to change it. And everybody that I know that was born around the time that I was born believed this, and it was still believed even as recently as 10 years ago, that you couldn't really change the brain. What we've learned in the last 10 years, and particularly the last 5, unequivocally, the brain can change, and the brain responds to use and disuse just like any other organ in our body. And we're seeing that mental weaknesses really can be strengthened with training. So what does the research tell us? The research tells us that it doesn't really matter what your skills are. It doesn't matter what your diagnosis or not diagnosis is. It doesn't matter what your age is. There is a significant amount of evidence that indicates that your brain can change, and it can change significantly from training. The average increase that you can get when you do brain training correctly, and I say that correctly because I'm going to point to something here in a moment, is 15-point increase in IQ. And that 15-point increase is a full standard deviation. That's, for those of you who know statistics, you'll know that it's significant, but it's huge. Now, for every research study that says you can get a significant change from brain training, there is probably another research study that says you don't get a significant change. I will tell you to look under the covers. Typically, the research studies that indicate brain training is not effective or does not provide a statistically significant change are studies that do not provide adequate time. So if I told you I wanted to lose 30 pounds and I was going to do that by walking 10 minutes 3 times a week, you would laugh at me. But that's what the brain training research shows, that brain training is not effective if you do it only 3 times a week for 10 minutes. So look under the covers when you are looking at research about brain training. The other key aspect of how is it delivered? The research indicates that having it delivered one-on-one is much more effective than having it delivered via some kind of online computer-based means. And the last one that is key here is that it's integrated.
Just the dressing, just put it on yourself.
And that means that it's not just one skill. You're not doing one thing over and over, because then what you're doing is really training the brain to do that one thing really well. But rather what you're doing is doing an integrated fashion. So look for the details of the research before you start to really understand whether or not that research study is looking at effective brain training. Now, you might ask the question or wonder, is it something where, does it change? Yes, we can see that it changes based upon this research and or based upon this this measurement of using a Woodcock-Johnson or using any other type of cognitive assessment. But the real question is, does it actually change the brain, or are we just teaching the brain tricks? This is something I get on a regular basis, is are we just teaching the brain tricks? Are we just showing it to do shortcuts and things of that nature? And what, once again, the research shows is that the brain itself is actually changing. So this is a functional MRI imaging, and it's done pre and post brain training. And it demonstrates that the global network is much more efficient when you have post brain training. What that means is, in short term, is the right and the left half of the brain are working more efficiently together, and those pathways and connections are more efficient. So it's not just something that we can measure using a cognitive assessment. We're also seeing it in actually when you look at the imaging of the brain and the neural pathways and the blood flow, that those pathways and connections are changing from brain training. So now that we have some research that supports the efficacy of an intervention of doing brain training, let's get into what is this? What is this brain training thing? And what do we mean by cognitive skill? So if we look at how we learn, the model I show here provides you a picture of, you have the cognitive skill and then you have your knowledge bank. Knowledge bank is where the schools are focused, okay? This is history, science, math, reading. The cognitive skills you use to get something into that knowledge bank or to retrieve that information when you need it are referred to as your cognitive skills. And what we do here is we focus on, when you're training the brain, you're not focused necessarily on knowledge bank, you're focused on the cognitive portion. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, how do I know what things I need to put into my knowledge bank? How do I know what I should train? And so we're going to get a little bit into what that is. Going into this is something that usually surprises most people. So if I could see you guys, I would ask you the question of how many of you are visual learners? And you'd raise your hand if you were. I would tell you that if you're a visual learner, you likely have a weakness in visual processing. And you might think, but wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. I learn visually, I take in information visually. And so why isn't that mean that I'm strong visually? And I would argue that what it means is that you have to see it to be able to understand it. You have to see it to really get the information into your brain and fully get your head wrapped around it. And if you need to see it, it means that your brain struggles with developing its own visual information, which is an indication that you have a visual processing weakness. On the other hand, if you are an auditory learner and you learn information through hearing information, talking about it, somebody presenting the information to you, likely you have a weakness in auditory processing. What that means is that you need to hear it, you need to have somebody explain it to you, you need to discuss it to understand the information. And that suggests that your brain doesn't automatically hear the information. So if you hear it spoken, you understand it better. That's different than if you read the information. Some people learn better by reading it because their auditory processing is very strong. And so they don't need to actually hear the words. When they read it, they are virtually hearing it in their ears. A kinesthetic learner is somebody who needs to touch, feel, interact with the material, move while they're doing it. And typically there's an indication that there's a processing speed and or working memory weakness. This is also areas, these two skills are consistent with weaknesses in attention. And I'll go back to that chart and show you that to you. And then for those that are more mechanical and very step by step, they need to have it all laid out one step after another, there's a logic and reasoning weakness. And those that need lots of repetition to remember the material indicates that there is a long-term memory weakness. So you might say, okay, well, if I have attention deficit, what is the weakness I have in terms of cognitive skill? And I will tell you that it depends. There are 7 different profiles that we've seen with attention deficit. And if I go back to the chart we have here with the different, the learning model, we can see here that the attention circle is next to processing speed and working memory. Those are 2 skills that can be weak when you have a relative weakness, when you have an attention weakness. The other area that we see from research that indicates that there might be an attention weakness or attention deficit is long-term memory. So what we see with these 3 skills, working memory, processing speed, and long-term memory, are 7 different profiles that can in fact be impacted. And it can be variations where you might have 1, 2, or all 3 of the weaknesses, and therefore you get the 7 different profiles. So we all have a weakness. I can tell you what mine is. Mine is long-term memory. And if you have a weakness, how do you train it? What do you do about it? And the research says you can train it rather than working around it. And most of the time we hear a lot about people with ADHD, work around it, create, coach them, put in mechanisms by which you won't forget, or accommodate. And we're a little different in that. We're saying, don't do that. Well, you might do it in the short term to build the bridge and make sure you don't lose the confidence, but train it just like you would any other muscle in your body. And the analogy I like to use is that if you had a child who struggled at batting in Little League, you wouldn't say to that child, oh, you struggle with batting, we're going to give you an accommodation. We're going to put up a tee so that you can hit it off the tee since you can't get it from the pitch. No, you wouldn't do that. You would train by practicing how do you hit the ball from a pitch. So the key difference here between training and teaching is if we look at when you're teaching knowledge and filling the knowledge bank, you're doing that through instruction. When you're trying to build cognitive skill, you do that through exercise. And that means you do it until it becomes automatic, okay? It's the analogy I like to use here is that you could never learn how to play the piano if you never put your fingers on the keys. You could never learn how to play an instrument if you never picked up that instrument and started to play it. This is the very same way I want you to think about brain training, is you can't teach the brain to do the work differently. You have to exercise it. And typically you get a lot of kind of, this doesn't feel good, I don't want to, this doesn't feel right. It's like you put on something and it's itchy until it becomes automatic, because you're teaching your brain to do something different. So what do you need to do brain training at home? So I'm going to give you the home training brain kit here. And you're going to think that this is kind of a little bit ridiculous, but you see here on our kitchen table a number of items that you can find in pretty much any household. And they don't have to be these exact items. What you see here is you can, I have paper, a pen, a ruler, because there's a number of things. I create some grids, as you can see here. There's cards. I took chess pieces, but they don't have to be chess pieces. I took, there's 4 different colored items here. So you can use Skittles, M&Ms, you can use fruit chews. It doesn't really matter as long as you have 4 different colors. I have some random items from our kitchen. And I also took some random items from our junk drawer in the kitchen. We all have that junk drawer. And then there's a few things that we use for brain training, but doesn't have to be these items. You can have a stopwatch, which we all have on our phones, and a metronome, and there's a metronome app, which I'll refer you to, and then a hacky sack or a bag. It's all pretty straightforward. So let's get started. What can we do with these random items in our house? The first one I'm going to show you is the card sort. The card sort really helps to train attention, processing speed, executive function, and I'm going to tell you different ways where you can do it, something that would be easy for maybe a 3, 4, or 5-year-old, or you can do it something that could even be challenging for somebody that is older. And the idea here is that you get faster and faster at sorting the cards. So I have an example here where the cards are sorted by color into 2 stacks. And then I also have an example here where the cards were sorted by 1 through 5s are in 1 stack, another stack were 6 through 10s, and then the face cards were in a 3rd stack. So there's 3 different cards, and that's the example here. You can do it by suit, so that would be 4 different stacks. You can do odd and even. It doesn't make it, you can even make it more difficult. You could do odd red, odd black, even red, even black. Make it as difficult as you want as you progress, but start simple with color and then gradually make it more difficult. The idea here is that you want to do this as quickly as possible. You want to be able to time it. You want to do it repetitively until you can get it very, very easy. And as soon as you can get it really easily, then you're able to move up to the next level. The key idea is start simple, master that, make it harder, make it harder, make it harder. And so you can start, the idea I want to share with you is that you can do it easily for a younger child, and it can get difficult for an older child. So another activity that you can do at home, I call it Skittles Sudoku. It could be M&M Sudoku. It could be, there we go. Okay, so what you need here is paper, pen, ruler, and 4 colors of items for each. I like to do it with Skittles or M&Ms because then afterwards you can eat them, but you can pretty much use, you could use Legos, you could use colored blocks. It doesn't have to be anything that's edible. If you don't want to, you could use the colored goldfish if you'd like to. The idea here is this is going to help train that logic and reasoning. And it's kind of fun where you start with, you draw a grid of 4 by 4. I used a ruler with a black pen on this, and I have my 4 of each color laid out here. And then you lay out, just put a few down. With the younger kids, you might have to put 6 to 8 down to make it more easy for them to figure it out. For the older kids, you just put down anywhere from 2 to 4 to make it a little bit more difficult. And then time, how quickly can they complete the grid? And the idea here is that you can't have the same color in any one column or any one row. Once that becomes easy, you can actually add more difficulty. And the idea here is you're seeing with every one of these as you start out easy and you gradually add difficulty. And the difficulty here that you want to add is being able to, you could actually put on the metronome and having them count on beat while they're doing it. You could be distracting them while they're doing it. You could have them do it with having to answer a question in between each one that they put down. So you want to make it as difficult as it needs to be for that person. And the difficulty should be, they can sort of do it, they're struggling a little bit, but it shouldn't be something where they want to run away screaming. Okay, so what's the next one we have? We have, I call it bag toss or ball toss. And with this one, what you need is a hacky sack or a ball. It should be something that can be relatively small. Actually, for a larger, for younger children, I suggest a larger ball that is easier to catch. Or you could even roll the ball back and forth if they don't have the ability to catch with both hands. That doesn't usually develop until you're about 6 or 7. You want a metronome or a metronome app. I like True Metronome, and I can play it for you just so you can get an idea of what True Metronome is like. I'll just play it for you here in the background. And I have this app on my phone. And I'm just trying to put it in here, and you can easily change the speed of it. We typically set and like to set it at 120, but for younger students, once again, for children who are maybe 5 or 6, you might want to set it at 85 or 108. 108 is your natural rate. And we typically set it at a rate where you're sharing it back and forth every other beat. And so what you're doing here is you're tossing the bag back and forth, and then you're counting or saying the alphabet. And when you're counting, you can count by 1s, 2s, 3s. You can make it more difficult. And so, for example, if I'm going to put it on, as I toss the ball, I'd say 1, it would land in the person's hand. And so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 4, 6, 8, 3, 6. What I like to do is say count by 3, starting with 1, 1, 4, 7, 10, 13, etc. Once you can do that, then you can actually spell a sentence where you're actually, each letter of the sentence, you're spelling it out. And you might think that should be really easy, but it is not as easy as it seems. You're going to have several restarts on that typically when you first do it. Once that gets easier, you can take out the spaces, and you don't say anything on the spaces, but you still toss the bag or ball. Then you can take out the vowels, but you still toss the bag or ball. So once again, start easy by just counting 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you skip count, and then skip count counting by 1, starting on 1, and then starting by spelling a sentence. And this is going to develop that all different kinds of attention. And as you progress, once again, you are making it more difficult, and you can add in, once again, more distractions and or loads by, as the other person is saying something, you're giving a word or a number, and they have to be able to remember that as they're progressing. All right, so next one I'm going to give to you, visualization list. This one is a lot of fun. I took random things from our house. I would just wanted to tell you, you don't need to even take items. You can just randomly take a list of words, but it's a little bit more fun when you have items on a table. And on this one, what you're doing is you're creating a story that you can remember. I usually start with maybe 10 items. I put them in the center of the table, and then each person takes a turn, whether it's 2 people or the entire family or however many you need. And you're going to take an item from the table and then add to the story. So for example, I might start with picking up the whisk and saying I was had this craving for chocolate chip muffins. So I was going to bake some chocolate chip muffins using the whisk. And then the next person comes along and says, when they came out of the oven, I had difficulty getting them to come out of the muffin pan. So I used a fork to help get them out of the muffin pan. And then the next person might say, make fun of me with my reading glasses and say, well, I was having difficulty seeing, so I needed my reading glasses to see what I was doing. And you can see as you progress through the story, so you're picking up the item and adding that item into the story. And when you're done, you then see who can remember the story in the exact sequence. And no matter what your memory is, you're going to find that you'll have some difficulty. Some people are going to have some difficulty. Now, as you progress, you can add more items. And then also you can take away the items, and they just have to randomly add something to the story. What this does is it gets people to understand and get automatic the ability to link items through creating a story or and it doesn't have to even make sense, but helping you to remember and having that association with those items through something that is something you can relate to and remember much better from a story than just randomly, if I were to list the 10 items, can you remember them? You can do different variations on this with things like, I could put them all into a bag, dump out the bag, give you 5 seconds to look at it, and then hide the items and see how many items you could remember. And that would be a way to, once again, see how quickly you can do it. And you can do it with giving them 10 seconds, then 8 seconds, and 6 seconds, and less time to see if they can remember the items with less time. And that forces you to actually create these links faster. So that's a visualization activity. Attention compute, the next one we're going to do. I use a deck of cards with this because cards didn't fit onto the slide very well. I just put some numbers down the columns, and I put 10, but I've done it where I've lined up actually 2 columns of 5 cards. And what you need here are the cards. I suggest you have a metronome and or stopwatch. And what you're going to do is something where you're just adding a number to each one, a constant number to each number in the column. And I said the cards. You could also just put numbers in a column on a page. So if I said 2, you would add 2 to each of these numbers. So it would be 6, 4, 7, 8, 9, 3, 10, 11, 5, 2. And what's interesting here is many people, adults included, know their math facts, but if you put them onto a metronome and force that math fact to come all the way down to those 10, all 10 of them, you'll find that people hesitate and they get mad because they know the answer, they just can't get it out. And usually what that's an indication of is they had a slight little lapse in attention, and this builds that sustained attention. Now you might be asking, why do it on beat? What is the beat thing? That is the divided attention. And people with an attention weakness struggle with divided attention. They like to go into a hyper-focused mode where they block everything out and then they can focus. And you can do that for short periods of time, but you can't do that for extended periods of time. So this is a way to develop that divided attention. Now you can make it more interesting by, when I did this with my daughter, it was a lot of fun. I put down the 10 cards, and then I would flip over a card, and she'd have to add whatever that number on that card is to each of the 10 numbers. And then I would flip over another card without losing a beat, and you have to add that number now to each of the numbers, and flip over a 3rd card, 4th card, 5th card, which of course you can imagine builds that sustained attention. So as I said, once again, I put this numbers on the board here, but I just suggest using plain playing cards. You can make this even more interesting. So what you could do is you could lay out the cards as I have here. And let's say that I laid out these 3 cards here, 4, 2, and 2. Have them do one mathematical computation to the first 2, and then a second mathematical computation to the second 2. So perhaps I have them add the first 2, so it would be 6, and then subtract the 3rd number, which would be 4. And then you can put down 3 more cards. They wouldn't see it, and they'd say 3, and the difference is 3, not -3. And then you'd say 5, and the difference is 3. And you'd add these 2, which would be 9, and you'd say the difference is 5. You can even do 4 cards in the stack and have them do computations. And once again, you might think that it's just math. It does get those math facts more automatic, which is a very important skill. It does build that math fluency, but it's also an attention where you have to constantly do the next one, the next one, the next one. And when you act the metronome, it makes it even more complex in that you're building that sustained attention throughout the process, and the divided attention having to stay on beat. All right, so for our next one, reasoning tic-tac-toe. I usually like to demonstrate this and make it more interactive, but here what you just need is a piece of paper with the grid on it with the 1 through 9. Typically we play tic-tac-toe with X's and O's. On this one, we're not going to play with X's and O's. We're going to play with our brain. And what we do is you play by identifying the number. So if I were to first say 5, then the next person might say 1, and then I have to pick another number. I might say 8, and they might block me by saying 2, and I would block them saying 3, and they would block me because I have 3 and 5 with 7, which would mean that I'd need to block them because they have the 1 and 7 by saying 4. They would block me saying 6, and then the last number is left is 9. So what this shows you is I'm playing in my brain, and I'm walking you through it and reminding you what I said versus the other person, because it's a little bit more difficult. But when you play this with each other, it can be a lot of fun, because it is a lot harder to keep all of that information in your brain. So you're really exercising that working memory in this, but it's in a very fun way to do it. Now, if that becomes too easy, start to put it on beat, which is why I have the metronome. So as once again, I'm just going to give you an example here with the metronome. And I'll call out the different numbers. It's not as, it would be more interesting if I had another person playing with me, but here we go. Ready? I'm going to just do it. So if I said 5, 1, 2, 8, you get the idea of how much harder it is. That was every beat. Now you might ask yourself the question of, is that too hard? Yes, for most people that is too hard. So typically what we recommend is saying do it every 5th beat, every 4th beat, every 3rd beat, every 2nd beat, etc. And then when that gets too easy, and it will, you might say that's your brain is exploding. How could you do that? But it will get too easy. You need to move it up, make it harder. And how do you make it harder? Take away the numbers. What I mean is this grid is blank. You're not looking at a grid. You are just keeping it all in your head. And so, as I said before, start easy. With your youngest kids, start with just making X's and O's, and then have them doing X's and O's on beat, where they're doing every 4th beat, every 3rd beat, every 2 beats. You can then add just the grid, where they're actually looking at the grid and calling out the numbers. Then take the grid away and keep the grid in your head. All right, so on to another memory exercise. And this is also visual processing. Memory match. Here we go. Okay, so memory match. What you need to do this is a paper, pen, and ruler. And what I have to put here are, I drew a grid on 2 pieces of paper. Each piece of paper has a 2x3 grid on it. You need 6 or more items to each of them. I found, chess pieces. You always have all your chess pieces. And then once again, a metronome or a metronome app would be very helpful to have with it. You see here, I have a manila folder, and that can be used as well. Or anything that it's a little bit stiff. So let me walk you through how you do this. So with the metronome going on in the background, you're going to have the manila folder between the 2 sides. And the trainer, I call it the trainer, will arrange on their side behind the shield the items on their grid. The more items, the more difficult. So start with 1 or 2, maybe 3 items. And then you lift the shield, and while counting 1, 2, 3 on beat, the student is looking at the trainer's grid and trying to memorize where all the items are. You then place the grid back down, and the student continues to count 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and place their items to replicate the placement of the trainer items. What you'll see here is this is if I picked up this piece of paper and I put it on top, that's what you're trying to do. You'll oftentimes see that people try to do it in a mirror image. You don't want a mirror image. That's what the brain wants to do. You want to do it as if this is the top row, this is the top row, this is the bottom row, this is the bottom row, if I'm sitting over here, okay? For your youngest students, for youngest kids that are in kindergarten, I typically suggest that you use just pawns and just have the pawns in 2 or 3 locations and see if they can remember the 2 or 3 locations for those pawns. As you progress, you can move it and make it more difficult. And then as you want to do, you also want to make sure that you're hiding the items that are not on the grid, because that gives them an indication of what you're not using. There's all kinds of things you can do to make this more difficult. Why would you count while you're doing this? And why do you do it on beat? Well, it's interesting. If you're trying to memorize information, it's a lot harder to memorize that information if you're counting. Even though counting is automatic for us, it puts another load on the brain, and it makes it that much more difficult. And then to have to continue to count while you're putting your pieces down, once again, puts that load on the brain. And the reason we do that is that load of counting pushes until that memory is automatic. And as you progress on this one, the progression is going up in terms of the number of items that you'd actually put down on the piece of paper or on the grid. So you can start with 3. As I said, for younger ones, younger kiddos, I would say start with 2 maybe, and have it be the same items. And it's just getting them to be very cognizant of which is the replication of the same pieces you have and the same items or same blocks on the grid. You can also simplify this by just doing a 2 by 2 with younger students, which is really effective. And just simplify it just to make it easier from that perspective. Once again, it doesn't have to be chess pieces. You just need to have 2 items of 2 of the same items of a number of different items. It could be bottle caps, it could be Legos, it could be whatever items you have in the house that would be similar. I find that you don't want them to be too dispersed in terms of the items, because it makes it easier to remember what the item is. If you have, for example, a key or rubber band, like the items you might have from a junk drawer, you want to have the items have some similarity, but a little bit of a difference. All right, so if you didn't get enough with all of those different exercises, I just gave you some more here that you can do. Is if this is your cognitive skill you're trying to train, here are some games that you might have around your house that could actually primarily train this cognitive skill. The reality is that any one of these games is training multiple skills. We do have, for those that are interested, something we'll send out with the presentation, which is a home-based brain training kit that you can use. It has some of these procedures in it and some new ones, so that you get some new ones in there. And we also have something that shows all these off-the-shelf games, 3 different pages of off-the-shelf games and what skills they train. The idea here is that you don't have to have your kids sitting in front of the video game. They don't have to have them sitting in front of a screen. That personal interaction that between 2 people or with the family makes it much more fun. Make it a competition. If they're sorting cards, have them compete against each other. You could even, with any one of these, it's much more game-like. And take turns in terms of, for example, on memory match, who's going to be the trainer and who's going to be the student, so that you get a chance to see what it's like to be on either side of this, so to speak. The 3 key takeaways I want you to get from this tonight is, number 1, don't forget that your skills can be built. Your brain is not dormant. Your brain is not going to go slide downwards. We used to think that, like, as we age and our skin loses its elasticity, our brain loses its cognitive skill. What we've learned is that that's not the case. And also, what you're born with is not what you have to stay with. If you have a relative cognitive weakness, train it. And think of life as a training ground. All of these things are around the house. You don't have to have something special. It doesn't have to be a specific vehicle by which you do this. You can challenge yourself. And what you'll find is, if you take these things, you could have your family create new challenges with each other and make it even harder within any one of these, where they have to create it. You could create obstacle courses where you have a bag and then you have to sort the cards, and then you have to add the 2s, and then you have to remember a sequence of items. It does, I'd say, tell people to think of life as a training ground. For people for all of the adults that are on the phone today, I tell you, add something new that you do every day to do it a little differently. You know, when you go into the grocery store, don't go to the right or the left like you always do. Start in a different aisle and then complete your shopping list. And you'd be amazed at how much more difficult it is to do shopping that way. For women, when we actually get out of the house, I say, select your jewelry and then pick out your outfit. For the men, for those that do wear ties, select the tie and then pick out your outfit. And find opportunities where you have to spend the time anyway. Maybe you're eating with your opposite hand all day long. The story I like to tell is the way I keep my brain sharp is by doing something new. When my two girls were on the dive team one summer, I became a dive judge. I don't know anything about diving, but I became a dive judge. And I went to the class and was a dive judge for the B meets, not the A meets, but it challenged me. I had to learn something new very fast. Now, the advantage I had is I was going to be at the dive meet anyway. I got the best parking spot and I got the best seat at the diving meet because I was right in front of the diving boards. So, but yet I pushed myself to learn something new with no additional time except for the class I had to go to. So make it fun through playing games, add new twists to your day to make it interesting. You can keep your brain very sharp. So with that, I think we have 15 minutes for questions. Irene, I'm going to unmute you so you can ask any questions that have been put into the chat.
Yeah, and you know what? I don't think anyone knew to chat with me, so we didn't.
Oh.
So let's just let people, anybody has any questions? Lots of people still on mute.
Yeah, so if you have a question, just unmute yourself.
No question. Who was that? Was that somebody getting ready to do a question?
Thought I had seen five questions in there. Go ahead.
I have a question. So let's see, once you finish, like you acquire this kind of skills, so it becomes kind of second nature to that person. So does the skill, like the memory, become a plateau, or is it like, you know, like the skill is being old, like you're riding a bicycle, is it still helping the brain? Or?
Yeah, it still helps the brain to do it, to keep it sharp. But I would tell you, you don't have to continue to do it to retain the skill. It is something where, you know, even if I haven't been on a bicycle in 5 years and I get jump on the bike, I remember how to do it within seconds. The key, and also just because you're not doing this training doesn't mean that your brain isn't using that skill every day. We use our skills in life as we go along all the time. And so your brain is not going to go back to the old way, the hard way to do it. It's going to use the new, faster, easier way to do it. And it's going to continue to default to the new, easier way. So that becomes even sharper and stronger rather than having to necessarily train it every day. And that's one difference between the analogy I use about this is like the personal brain trainer for the brain. People say, well, after I stop going to the gym, I get out of shape. I said, yes, but that's because you're not pushing your body the way you do at the gym. With your brain, you're using it every day. The challenge we have right now is our kids are not using their brains like they have in the past when they're in school 7.5 hours a day. They're only getting a few hours of real demand on their brain. And so this is a way to do something where you don't tell them, do more worksheets, have them do something fun, like playing games, but it's actually building their skills.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Are you gonna make these, can you make these slides available for reference, or?
Yes, I'll make these slides available for everybody. We'll email them out to everybody along with a home braining toolkit that you can refer to that has some additional games in it as well.
Okay, great, thank you.
Hi there. There's a few questions in the chat, but I'll just address mine. If you guys have looked at sort of the meditation apps, like Muse, where they do sort of EEG biofeedback to show how the things you're doing have an impact. I'm just wondering if you could imagine these things working together with something like that, so you can see
Yeah,
the
they
result.
can. Yes, they can work together. They're different because the meditation apps and/or the neurofeedback is really training the brain waves to respond in a different way to a situation. And that is different than training the actual skill that you need. When you're doing the brain training, the key aspect I try to tell kids when they're doing this, they always want to win. They want to be the best. They want to be the fastest. And I tell you that the games that they're going to want to play are the ones that they're good at, the ones they can always win. The games that they should play are the ones that they're bad at. Because the games that they don't like and the games that they're bad at are an indication of where their relative weakness is. And that's how you train it. And then you also need to train the emotional response that comes with that, as we all do, right? None of us like to do things we're not good at. But if you go into it saying, and I tell parents this all the time, don't expect that they're going to get it right away. Think of it when they first learned to walk. I beckon back to those days when we were so excited the first day our child took a step, or the first time our child even pulled themselves up. And we celebrated the first step and celebrated the first time they took 3 steps. That's what I want you to celebrate. I want you to look for those little tiny changes, not that they do it once and they've got it. And if you encourage that level of practice and the time that it just takes to get this to be automatic, there will be less pressure and less emotional response to, I'm not good at this. There's a lot of things, and I encourage you as parents, you do the things that you're not good at and show them that it's okay not to be good at it, and to practice and you get better at it. And so the key phrase I like to use when kids say, I can't do that, and I say, yet. With practice, you can do anything you set your mind to. So answer your question, they're complementary. This is more skill and versus the emotional response that you have to a certain situation. Other questions? I'm trying to go to the chat, but I think because I'm, let me see if I get out of the slideshow. I'm going to stop share and see if with the stop share, I'm able to, here's more chat. Yep. So how much time per day, week do you recommend spending on these activities? The key aspect here is the more time you spend, the more benefit you're going to get to all the activities. Generally, I would say it's not 10 minutes a day. If you only have 10 minutes a day, which of course I respect all of that as well, I would say that you want to spend 10 minutes a day on a few activities and do it daily. I typically try to tell people to put it into their day where they would have to do it anyway. But if you're trying to get significant change, meaning if you're trying to get that 15 standard score increase in IQ, you want to do more like several hours. And when I say several hours, meaning 4 to 5 hours a week. And that's where you want to have a lot more variety in the activities that you're doing so that you don't get bored with it. Another question was able to participate, couldn't officially register. The psych neuro researcher working on with the ADD clinic here in Toronto will be able to get join mailing list later for the slides. Yes, we'll be sending that all out. Will the results of the cognitive training generalize to improve other executive functions? Executive function is really can be defined, not just in terms of how it presents, but you will see that if you do a cognitive profile of anybody with an executive function disorder, once again, there isn't one type. Executive function disorder means they have difficulty getting things done, but there might be some things they can get done easily and other things they can't, they really struggle with. It is something that you see cognitive profiles that are typically associated with it. The most common is the processing speed weakness. Working memory is another one. Long-term memory can be another one. So they're similar to the attention deficit. It presents differently clinically though. And so when you train the skills, yes, the executive function challenges dissipate. Depending upon how long you've been trying to or living with the executive functions, you oftentimes have to relearn how to get through things. But the cognitive weakness that's contributing to that executive function, once you train that, the executive function challenges dissipate with the increase or strengthening of the skill. Another question is, would I consider complex jigsaw puzzles to be brain training? Yes, if jigsaw puzzles are not your strength. So one of the things we oftentimes do is we tend to go to the things that we're good at. So I'm very good with logic and reasoning. I'm very visual. I love jigsaw puzzles. I love Sudoku. I'm horrible at crossword puzzles because my long-term memory is my weakness. So you want to do the things you're not good at to train your brain. What I mean by that is that if you have strengths and weaknesses, making your strengths stronger is not going to give you a lot of lift. What you really want to do to get a significant change in your brain is train the weaknesses. Bringing those weaknesses up significantly is going to give you a much more, a much larger change in your brain. It's also going to provide you a skill that you're not using and you avoid rather than, and integrating it rather than avoiding it. We all tend to avoid our weaknesses. So you want to train those things that you're not good at. And it's not human nature to do that. It's not fun to do that. When we go to the gym, we like to do the things we're good at, and we don't like to do the things we're not good at. And that's why we typically take a class or have a personal trainer to push us beyond our comfort zone, but that's what's required. So if you're good with Scrabble or crossword, Scrabble and crossword puzzles, don't do those things. It's not going to hurt you to do them, but that's not really going to train your brain. You want to do things that you're not good at. Would any of these methods work well in conjunction? We've asked that one, sorry. Just going through the questions here in the chat. Can you speak to the assertion that if you practice these games, that one will only improve in the games, that it doesn't translate to other skills of a similar nature? It's an excellent question, Tammy. So there is a lot of research that where it says that you can train that skill and it does not translate to everyday life. What do you need to do to make sure that you do get that translation? Number one, you have to train more than one skill. If there's any kind of brain training program that you're doing that trains one particular skill really well, you will see an increase in that skill. It won't necessarily translate to life. And the analogy that I use is, if I broke my arm and I had a cast on, I took the cast off and I went to physical therapy and strengthened that arm in physical therapy and lifted weights and got all that range of motion back, but didn't use that arm throughout the day. I only did that in physical therapy. You're not going to see a benefit from that physical therapy because I'm not using that arm. You need to integrate that newly strengthened skill with the other skills. So training one skill at a time or in isolation or just a few skills does not translate or generalize as well. You have to do it in an integrated fashion. And the other component that we see, and we believe, we don't have the research yet that really explains why, but what we see and the hypothesis is that in-person training is where you get that generalization. For change to be permanent, to become part of who you are, to internalize it, you need to have that personal component to it. And so that's why we see that we believe that the in-person training one-on-one is more effective than when you just do it on a computer screen. But we don't yet have the research that explains it. We just know that the in-person is more effective than on the computer screen. And we also know that training when it's multiple cognitive skills in a variety of ways. So doing, what I mean by that is when you're training processing speed, you can't train processing speed with one activity. You have to do it in a multitude of activities and integrate it with a multitude of activities. So you might do just processing speed. Now let's do processing speed and visualization. Now let's do processing, visualization, and logic and reasoning. And that's where you get that generalization. But if you, to your point, if you do just one skill and you practice that one game or that one activity, it doesn't translate or generalize as well as when you do it in an integrated fashion. Turning down, I think that answers all the questions. Are there any other questions? I saw a number of them here. Any other questions? We're at 8 o'clock on top of the hour. So we respected your time. We will send out the presentation as well as a packet just so that you have more tools in your toolkit, so to speak. The key thing here is parents, you don't need to have big fancy things. You don't need to spend a lot of money. You have lots of things in your house. And as you progress in this, have your kids challenge you and you challenge your kids. I'm almost certain that you are going to be able to come up with more difficult, more challenging levels than I've even showed you tonight. And that's what makes this kind of fun and makes it more of an everyday activity as opposed to a once and done. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy your evening.